Hold up for a second. Did ESPN's top WNBA play-by-play voice just publicly challenge the Indiana Fever's roster construction? Because that's exactly what it sounded like. And if you missed it, don't worry. We're breaking it all down. I'm Dre Fiber. This is Street Hoops. And today we're talking about comments that could spark one of the biggest basketball debates of the entire season. Before we get into what was said, you need to understand who Ryan Ruocco is and why his opinion carries so much weight. This isn't some social media personality looking for attention. This isn't a former player trying to generate headlines. Ryan Ruocco is ESPN's lead voice for WNBA basketball. He has spent years covering the league's biggest stars and biggest moments. He called Caitlin Clark's legendary college career at Iowa. He narrated the logo threes, the impossible passes, the record-breaking performances, and the unforgettable tournament runs that turned Clark into a national phenomenon. He's watched her game evolve from close range. He's studied her strengths. He's seen what works and what doesn't. So when Ruocco speaks about Caitlin Clark's game, people listen. Recently, during an appearance on the Girls Trip podcast, Ruocco made a statement that immediately grabbed attention throughout the basketball world. He called Caitlin Clark the best pick-and-roll player in the entire WNBA. Not one of the best, not top three, the best. That's an enormous compliment coming from someone who watches every elite guard in the league. But what came next was even more interesting. Ruocco suggested that Indiana's roster has not been constructed in a way that fully maximizes Clark's greatest strength. In other words, he believes the Fever still haven't built the ideal system around their franchise superstar. Now, that's a conversation worth having. Because when someone with Ruocco's experience says something like that publicly, isn't random criticism. It's basketball analysis. And it points directly at one of the biggest questions surrounding Indiana's future. Are they truly building around Caitlin Clark? Or are they simply building a team and hoping Clark makes everything work? There's a difference. Let's look at the context. Coming into the 2026 season, expectations for Indiana were sky high. Clark entered the year healthy and motivated after battling injuries during portions of the previous season. Despite missing significant time, she still managed to prove she was one of the league's most impactful players whenever she stepped on the floor. The Fever also appeared to have a strong core. Kelsey Mitchell remained one of the league's most explosive scorers. Aaliyah Boston continued developing into one of the most complete centers in professional basketball. The front office added veteran depth and made several moves designed to strengthen the roster. On paper, it looked promising. Many analysts believed Indiana had all the ingredients necessary to become a legitimate championship contender. But basketball isn't played on paper. And according to Ruocco's comments, there may be a disconnect between talent and fit. That's where the pick-and-roll discussion becomes critical. For fans who may not be familiar with the strategy, the pick-and-roll is one of basketball's most effective offensive actions. A teammate sets a screen. The ball handler uses the screen. The defense is forced to react instantly. Every decision creates an opportunity. When executed correctly, it generates open shots, driving lanes, defensive breakdowns, and scoring chances all over the floor. The reason this matters is simple. Caitlin Clark is elite at reading defenses. She sees passing angles before defenders recognize they're open. She manipulates help defenders. She forces opponents into impossible choices. Double team her and she'll find the open shooter. Go under the screen and she'll pull up from deep. Switch defenders and she'll attack the mismatch. It's one of the most difficult offensive weapons to defend in modern basketball. And according to Ruocco, Indiana hasn't consistently surrounded her with the type of spacing and personnel that allows that weapon to reach its full potential. That's a significant observation, because history shows that championship organizations build systems around their superstars. The best teams don't ask elite players to adapt to average structures. They create structures that maximize elite players. Think about the greatest defensive teams in basketball history. Their personnel fit their stars. Every role player served a purpose. Every lineup complemented the strengths of the franchise centerpiece. That doesn't mean Indiana lacks talent. Far from it. The Fever have talented players across the roster. The issue being discussed is whether those pieces fit together in the most efficient way possible. And that's an entirely different conversation. What's fascinating is that this debate has been growing all season. Fans have questioned rotations. Analysts have discussed spacing. Commentators have debated offensive philosophy. Now, one of the most respected voices in basketball broadcasting has added his perspective to that discussion. That doesn't automatically mean he's right, But it does mean the concerns deserve serious attention. Because when someone with years of experience studying the game identifies a potential weakness, smart organizations listen. The scary part for the rest of the WNBA, if Ruocco is correct, Indiana may not have reached its ceiling yet. Think about that. If Caitlin Clark is already producing at an elite level, while operating within a system that isn't perfectly optimized for her strengths, what happens if the Fever eventually solve that equation? What happens when every piece fits? What happens when the spacing improves, the chemistry deepens, and the roster fully complements the most dangerous playmaker in women's basketball? That's the question hanging over the league right now. And if Indiana ever finds a perfect answer, the rest of the WNBA could have a very serious problem on its hands. Now, before anybody twists my words, let me make something crystal clear. Stephanie White is not some inexperienced coach trying to figure things out on the fly. She is one of the most respected basketball minds in the WNBA. She's won games, developed talent, and earned the respect of players throughout the league. Nobody is questioning her basketball intelligence. But great coaches can still build systems that don't perfectly fit great players. And that is the concern Ryan Ruocco is raising. The bigger question isn't whether Stephanie White knows basketball. The question is whether the Indiana Fever have created a system that fully unleashes Caitlin Clark's unique gifts. Because we're not talking about an ordinary all-star here. We're talking about a player who sees the floor differently than almost anyone in professional basketball. When Clark comes off a screen, she isn't just looking for her own shot. She's reading every defender, every rotation, every tiny mistake the defense makes. She processes the game at an elite level. And when the spacing is right, she turns defenses into puzzles that she solves in real time. That's what makes Ruocco's comments so important. He isn't saying Clark isn't succeeding. He's saying she could be even more dangerous. And that's the scary part. Think about what we've already seen from her. She's averaging close to 20 points per game. She's among the league leaders in assists. She's one of the biggest attractions in all of sports. And according to ESPN's lead WNBA broadcaster, Indiana still hasn't built the ideal roster around her. Let that sink in. The Fever are winning games. Clark is producing. The team is competitive. And yet one of the most connected voices in women's basketball believes there is still another level waiting to be unlocked. That's not criticism. That's opportunity. The issue comes back to spacing. Modern basketball revolves around space. Every extra foot a defender has to cover creates an advantage. Every shooter who forces a defender to stay attached opens driving lanes. Every stretch big who can knock down a three changes how the defense is allowed to rotate. When those pieces aren't in place, even elite point guards can find themselves operating in crowded conditions. Ruocco's argument is that Indiana hasn't consistently provided Clark with that ideal environment. And when you watch the games closely, it's hard not to see what he's talking about. There are possessions where Clark comes off a screen and immediately sees two defenders waiting. There are moments where passing lanes disappear because opponents don't fully respect certain shooters on the floor. There are stretches where defenses look comfortable instead of terrified. And when Caitlin Clark has the basketball, comfortable defenses are exactly what you don't want. Because the entire point of building around a superstar is making life uncomfortable for the other team. That's why Ruocco's comments about former Fever players caught so much attention. When he pointed to players leaving Indiana and finding greater success elsewhere, he wasn't making excuses. He was identifying a pattern. A pattern doesn't automatically prove anything, but patterns create questions. And those questions deserve answers. Why have certain players looked more productive after leaving? Why do some offensive pieces appear more effective in different systems? Why do certain strengths seem to flourish elsewhere? Those are legitimate basketball discussions, not personal attacks, not drama. Basketball questions. And here's where things become really interesting. Because while Ruocco was discussing roster construction and offensive philosophy, many fans immediately connected those comments to the larger conversation surrounding the Fever this season. The sideline controversy, the roster debates, the trade rumors, the endless media narratives. Everything suddenly started feeling connected. Now, to be fair, Ruocco never said Indiana should trade Caitlin Clark. He never suggested the organization is dysfunctional. He never accused anyone of intentionally holding her back. What he did say was something much simpler. The roster could be better optimized around her strengths. And honestly, that might be the most important observation of all, because championship teams don't just collect talent. They fit talent together. The best organizations understand that success isn't about having good players. It's about having the right players in the right roles. Look across basketball history. Magic Johnson had shooters and finishers. Steve Nash had floor spacers. LeBron James won championships when surrounded by players who complemented his skill set. Every all-time great benefits from a roster designed to maximize what they do best. That's the challenge facing Indiana right now. Not whether Caitlin Clark is good enough. She's already proven that. Not whether the Fever have talent. They clearly do. The challenge is whether the organization can take the next step and build a roster that fully unlocks everything Clark brings to the floor. Because if Ryan Ruocco is right, and if Indiana still hasn't created the perfect environment for her game, then the rest of the WNBA should be very nervous. Because the version of Caitlin Clark we're seeing today might not even be the final version. And if the Fever ever solve that puzzle completely, if they surround her with ideal spacing, ideal personnel, and a system built specifically around her strengths, the league could be dealing with something far more dangerous than an all-star. They could be dealing with a dynasty. And that's exactly why Ryan Ruocco's comments matter. Not because they criticize Indiana, but because they reveal just how much untapped potential may still be sitting in front of all of us. Let's be clear about one thing before we go any further. Nobody is questioning Stephanie White's defensive brilliance. Her reputation was built on defense long before she became one of the most recognizable coaches in the WNBA. At Connecticut, she earned respect as a strategist who could identify weaknesses, create pressure, and make even elite offenses uncomfortable. Her teams compete. Her teams defend. Her teams rarely beat themselves. That side of the equation isn't the issue. The question Ryan Ruocco raised is much more specific. Can Indiana's offensive system fully unlock Caitlin Clark? That's where the debate begins. Ruocco wasn't attacking White. He wasn't calling for changes. What he was doing was asking whether the offensive structure currently in place has limitations, whether certain players thrive inside it, while others are forced to operate below their maximum potential. And when you look at the first month of the season, those questions start sounding a lot more reasonable, which brings us to May 30th. The Indiana Fever versus the Portland Fire. Before that game, Indiana was 4-2. Think about that for a second. 4 wins, 2 losses. The Fever weren't struggling. The season wasn't falling apart. Caitlin Clark was putting together an early MVP-level campaign, averaging around 24 points and 9 assists, while carrying enormous expectations every single night. The Golden State loss earlier in the road trip wasn't ideal, but it was understandable. Teams lose games. Nobody panicked. Then Portland happened, and Portland felt different. Not because of the final score alone, because of how it looked. There are games where a team simply misses shots, and there are games where everything feels disconnected. The timing is off. The spacing looks wrong. Players appear unsure of where they're supposed to be. The offense loses rhythm. That's what Portland felt like. Clark struggled. The Fever struggled. And then came the timeout that launched 1,000 headlines. Television cameras caught a heated exchange between Clark and head coach Stephanie White. The clip spread across social media at lightning speed. Millions of people watched the footage. They saw White animated and frustrated. They saw Clark responding. They saw tension. They saw emotion. And moments later, rookie Raven Johnson was brought into the game. Veterans Kelsey Mitchell and Michaela Timpson appeared to help calm the situation. Clark was visibly frustrated. The cameras caught everything. Within hours, the internet had already reached its verdict. Some fans claimed there was a locker room crisis. Others declared the relationship between Clark and White was broken. Every sports talk show suddenly had an opinion. Even Skip Bayless jumped into the chaos with claims that Stephanie White had been fired. She hadn't. Not even close. But once a narrative starts moving online, facts often struggle to keep up. People began dissecting every clip, every facial expression, every timeout, every post-game interview. Suddenly, everyone became an expert on a relationship they knew almost nothing about. That's where Ryan Ruocco's perspective became interesting. Because he didn't focus on the drama itself, he focused on what might have been underneath it. Ruocco described the moment as a breakthrough point, a moment when frustrations that had quietly existed beneath the surface finally became visible. Not necessarily personal frustrations, basketball frustrations, competitive frustrations, the kind that emerge when elite athletes see the game differently. And here's what makes that observation compelling. Caitlin Clark possesses one of the highest basketball IQs in the sport. Players at that level see everything. They notice missed opportunities. They recognize spacing problems. They identify defensive mistakes before they happen. They see open passing windows that most players never notice. Clark understands when a pick and roll isn't creating enough pressure. She understands when help defenders are cheating into the paint. She understands when spacing isn't forcing defenses to make difficult decisions. You don't reach her level without seeing those details. Ruocco's argument was that Portland may have been the night those internal frustrations finally surfaced. Not because Clark stopped believing in her coach, not because she stopped trusting the process, but because highly competitive people eventually express what they've been holding inside. Then came perhaps the most controversial part of Ruocco's comments. He suggested that certain attitudes about Clark may exist within organizational circles behind the scenes. Not necessarily public attitudes, not official statements, internal perspectives, conversations, opinions, the kind of things fans rarely hear about. Ruocco implied that some of those viewpoints may not be entirely supportive of the franchise superstar. And he suggested that when coaches operate inside an organization, they inevitably absorb parts of the environment around them. That's a significant observation coming from someone with Ruocco's credibility. This isn't a random social media personality chasing engagement. This is ESPN's lead WNBA voice, someone who has spent years around teams, executives, coaches, and players. Someone whose job places him closer to the action than most commentators ever get. Now, fairness matters, and fairness requires acknowledging what happened next. Because both Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White addressed the situation publicly. Clark made her position clear. She said she rides with Coach White. She defended her coach. She dismissed the idea that there was some major feud taking place behind closed doors. White did the same. Both women presented a united front. Both emphasized competition. Both described the exchange as part of the emotional reality of high-level basketball. And maybe that's exactly what it was. Maybe Portland was simply a difficult night between two fierce competitors who desperately wanted to win. Or maybe it revealed deeper basketball questions that still need answers. Either way, Ryan Ruocco's comments ensured that those questions aren't going away anytime soon. And as the season continues, every game will bring new evidence. What makes this story fascinating is that both sides can be telling the truth at the same time. Caitlin Clark publicly defended Stephanie White, and she didn't do it with generic press conference language. She got personal. She got emotional. She shared a memory that revealed just how deep that relationship actually goes. Clark recalled the moment she suffered her groin injury during the Connecticut game in 2025. She talked about breaking down in tears on the sideline and crying in Stephanie White's arms. That's not the kind of story someone invents to calm down a media storm. That's a real moment between a player and a coach. White matched that energy. She said her relationship with Clark is strong. She said she loves coaching her. She dismissed the idea of any major conflict and explained that challenging players is simply part of her coaching style. In her view, the timeout exchange became a national story because of Clark's superstar status. And honestly, there's truth in that. If that exact same interaction had happened between a coach and a role player, nobody outside Indiana would have cared. Then came the Atlanta Dream game. The Fever responded with an 83-71 victory. The defense looked sharper. The rotations were cleaner. The switching wasn't as reckless. Clark and White shared a hug during the game. From the outside looking in, it appeared that the storm had passed. The public version of the story has a happy ending. Two highly competitive people had a heated moment. The team held a lengthy meeting. Everyone cleared the air. The Fever moved forward together. I believe that happened. I also believe there's another layer to this conversation. Because loving and trusting your coach doesn't mean you agree with every basketball decision being made. And that's where things get interesting. Caitlin Clark isn't just a star player. She's one of the most advanced defensive minds in basketball. You don't shatter NCAA assist records by accident. You don't lead professional leagues in playmaking while battling injuries by accident. You don't see passing angles that other players can't even imagine by accident. Clark processes the game differently. She sees opportunities before they exist. She recognizes defensive mistakes instantly. She understands spacing at an elite level. And when a player with that level of basketball intelligence sees offensive limitations over and over again, eventually those frustrations start building. Not personal frustrations, basketball frustrations. the kind that come from knowing exactly what could work if all the pieces fit together. That's why I think both things can be true. Clark genuinely respects Stephanie White, and Clark also understands that this offense still hasn't reached its full potential. Those ideas don't contradict each other. They can coexist. The larger question facing Indiana is what kind of team they ultimately want to become. Because right now, there's a philosophical tug-of-war happening beneath the surface. Stephanie White has always been a defense-first coach. That's her foundation. She builds aggressive, defensive systems. She values pressure. She values toughness. She wants opponents uncomfortable every second they're on the floor. Those are strengths. But defensive systems come with trade-offs. When you switch everything defensively, every screen and every action creates a new matchup. That means smaller defenders sometimes end up guarding larger players. It means players can be isolated in situations that aren't ideal. And that's exactly what happened against Portland. The Fire attacked those mismatches relentlessly. They targeted Clark. They hunted one-on-one opportunities. They forced difficult defensive possessions over and over again. That's not solely on Clark. That's part of a larger schematic discussion. And that brings us back to Ryan Ruocco's most intriguing point. Because he didn't just identify a problem, he offered a solution. Ruocco suggested that Indiana may not need to look outside the organization at all. The answer might already be sitting on the roster. He pointed directly at Justine Powell. In his view, Powell possesses the exact skill set that could unlock another level of Indiana's offense. Why? Because she brings something the Fever desperately need. Shooting. Real shooting. The kind of shooting that forces defenders to stay attached. The kind of shooting that stretches defenses to their breaking point. The kind of shooting that creates space for Clark to operate. Ruocco's vision is simple. Put Powell at the 4. Let her function as a true stretch forward. Force opposing defenses to respect the perimeter. Create wider driving lanes. Open passing windows. And suddenly Clark's pick-and-roll game becomes even more dangerous. Now this is where some fans might get uncomfortable, because Ruocco's ideal rotation would likely move players like Sophie Cunningham, Lexi Hull, and Monique Billings into bench roles. Not because they aren't valuable players. They absolutely are. Cunningham brings toughness and energy. Hull brings defense and hustle. Billings brings athleticism and physicality. But basketball isn't always about collecting talent. Sometimes it's about finding the right combination of talent. And according to Ruocco, the combination Indiana is currently using may not be the one that maximizes the most important player on the floor. And if that's true, then the Fever's biggest breakthrough may not require a blockbuster trade, a coaching change, or a roster overhaul. It may simply require putting the right pieces in the right places. And that's where Ryan Ruocco's argument becomes impossible to ignore. He isn't saying the Indiana Fever are untalented. He isn't saying the roster is broken. What he's saying is something far more important. The pieces are there, but they are not being arranged in a way that fully unlocks the most dangerous offensive player in women's basketball. According to Ruocco, the solution may already be sitting on the Fever bench. He pointed directly toward Yvonne Ejim as a player who could potentially provide the floor spacing this offense desperately needs. A forward capable of stretching defenses beyond the three-point line changes everything for Caitlin Clark. Suddenly, defenders can't collapse into the paint. Suddenly, help defenders have to think twice before leaving their assignments. Suddenly, every pick and roll becomes a nightmare to defend. That's the entire point. Clark's greatest weapon isn't simply her scoring. It's the chaos she creates. Every time she dribbles off a screen, defenders panic. They know she can launch from well beyond the arc. They know she can fire a no-look pass through a window nobody else sees. They know she can punish even the smallest defensive mistake. But for that chaos to become truly unstoppable, the floor has to be spaced correctly. Ruocco's ideal rotation reflects that philosophy. He envisions a lineup built around maximizing Clark's strengths rather than forcing her to adapt to limitations. A lineup where shooting surrounds her. A lineup where defenders are stretched to their breaking point. A lineup that creates impossible decisions every possession. And when he talked about the bench, he painted a picture that should excite Fever fans. Rookie guard Raven Johnson was one of the first names he mentioned. Johnson brings relentless defense, energy, and toughness. She gives Indiana something every contender needs: the ability to maintain intensity when its superstar rests. Then there's Michaela Timpson, Another young player with upside and versatility. Add veterans like Sophie Cunningham, Lexi Hull, and Monique Billings in reserve roles. And suddenly Indiana has a second unit capable of wearing opponents down while Clark catches her breath. That's how championship teams are built. Not by asking one player to carry everything, but by creating waves of pressure that never stop. The numbers make Ruocco's case even stronger. Caitlin Clark isn't just a great point guard. She is a gravitational force. Every defense in the league bends toward her location on the floor. The moment she crosses half court, defenders are already adjusting. They know she can shoot from distances most players wouldn't even consider. They know she can deliver passes before teammates realize they're open. They know she can create points from seemingly nothing. That kind of gravity is rare. In fact, it's historically rare. Basketball analysts often talk about spacing, but what they're really talking about is maximizing gravity. The more space Clark has, the more dangerous she becomes. The more dangerous she becomes, the more impossible it becomes to defend everyone else. It's a chain reaction, and right now, Ruocco believes Indiana isn't fully taking advantage of it. To be fair, the Fever front office did have a plan. Their vision wasn't irrational. Adding Monique Billings gave them rebounding, toughness, rim pressure, and physicality. The logic was simple. Clark would draw attention on the perimeter, and Billings would capitalize near the basket. There's basketball logic in that approach. The problem is that defenses adjust. If opponents don't fear your power forward from beyond the arc, they can send extra defenders toward the paint. They can clog driving lanes. They can recover more quickly. Suddenly, what looks good on paper becomes much harder in practice. That's why Ruocco keeps returning to spacing. Not because Indiana's plan was foolish, because it may not be complete. Then came the turning point, the Portland loss, the sideline confrontation, the viral clip that dominated sports media for days. At first, it looked like a disaster. Fans panicked. Commentators speculated. Social media exploded. But according to Ruocco, that uncomfortable moment may have been exactly what Indiana needed. Because after the game, something happened that rarely happens in professional sports. The team talked, really talked. Not a quick film session, not a coach giving a speech. A genuine emotional 2-hour conversation where frustrations, concerns, expectations, and responsibilities were placed on the table. Players spoke honestly. Coaches listened. Everyone confronted realities that had been building for weeks. And the results showed up immediately. Against Atlanta, Indiana looked different. The energy was different. The defensive rotations were sharper. The communication was cleaner. The team appeared more connected. Most importantly, Clark and Stephanie White looked united. There was a visible sense of trust, a visible sense of understanding. That doesn't mean every problem disappeared overnight. It doesn't mean the roster suddenly became perfect. But it does mean progress happened. And sometimes that's all a team needs. Ruocco compared the Fever to an electric vehicle that simply needed a recharge. It's a perfect analogy. The talent was always there. The potential was always there. The problem wasn't a lack of ability. The problem was alignment. The players, coaches, and front office decisions all needed to point in the same direction. Now comes the real test. Can Indiana build on that momentum? Can they make the adjustments necessary to maximize the most gifted offensive player in the sport? Can they stop forcing Clark to fight through limitations and instead create a system designed to amplify everything she does best? Because if they can, the rest of the WNBA has a serious problem. And if they can't, the questions Ruocco raised aren't going away. They'll only get louder. For now, though, Fever fans have reason to be optimistic. The conversation happened. The wake-up call arrived. The talent remains. And somewhere inside this roster is a championship-caliber team waiting to emerge. The only question left is whether Indiana is willing to fully unleash it. One game doesn't define a season, and Ryan Ruocco was careful not to overreact. He wasn't celebrating a championship after a single win. He wasn't declaring every problem solved. What he said was much simpler and much more important. The direction looked better. The Indiana Fever finally looked like a team that understood what had gone wrong and was willing to address it. The electric vehicle had gotten its charge. Now comes the real question. Was it a full recharge that powers a championship run? Or was it simply enough energy to get through the next few weeks before the same issues resurface? That's what the rest of the 2026 season will reveal. And here's my final take on everything we've discussed. The Indiana Fever possess something every franchise spends decades searching for. A once-in-a-generation superstar. Not a very good player. Not an all-star. Not even just an MVP candidate. A transformational athlete. Caitlin Clark isn't simply changing games. She's changing expectations. She's expanding what fans believe is possible on a basketball court. She's forcing defenses to rethink schemes they've relied on for years. She's stretching the floor farther than anyone before her and creating passing angles that shouldn't exist. More importantly, she's bringing millions of new viewers into the sport. People who never watched the WNBA before now schedule their evenings around Fever games. People who couldn't name a single player 3 years ago now debate lineups, coaching decisions, and playoff projections. That's influence. That's impact. And that kind of impact comes with responsibility. The responsibility belongs to the front office. It belongs to the coaching staff. It belongs to everyone making decisions around this franchise. Because when a player like Caitlin Clark arrives, your job is not to make her fit the system. Your job is to build the system around her. That's why Ryan Ruocco's comments matter. He's not some random voice chasing attention. He's watched Clark's rise closer than almost anyone in sports media. He called the games. He witnessed the records. He watched the evolution from college superstar to professional phenomenon. He has seen every stage of the journey. So when someone with that level of access says Indiana hasn't fully built the right roster around the best pick-and-roll player in the league, that's not controversy. That's insight. That's someone identifying a problem before it becomes impossible to ignore. His message was clear. Create more spacing. Find the right stretch four solution. Build lineups that maximize Clark's strengths. Let her operate with room to attack. Run the pick and roll relentlessly. Force defenses into impossible decisions. Make opponents choose between giving up open threes or giving Clark clear lanes to the basket. Because if Indiana gets that formula right, the rest of the league is going to have a major problem. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. The Fever aren't far away. This isn't a rebuilding franchise hoping for a miracle. The talent is already in the building. The star is already in place. The fan support is stronger than it's ever been. The pieces exist. The question is whether the organization can assemble those pieces correctly before an incredible opportunity slips away. The Portland loss exposed weaknesses. The sideline confrontation forced uncomfortable conversations. The 2-hour team meeting created accountability. The Atlanta victory offered hope. Now the challenge is maintaining that momentum. Can Indiana continue making adjustments? Can they keep improving? Can they fully unlock the player who has already transformed their franchise? Those answers will determine how this season is remembered. Because championship windows don't stay open forever. Even when you have a superstar. Even when arenas are sold out. Even when national attention follows your every move. Opportunities disappear faster than people think. That's why Ruocco's warning deserves attention. Not because he's attacking the organization. Because he's trying to help it. He's pointing toward a higher ceiling and asking whether Indiana has the courage to reach for it. And honestly, that's the conversation every Fever fan should be having right now. Not whether Caitlin Clark is great. We already know she is. Not whether the team is talented. We already know that too. The real question is whether Indiana is willing to make the adjustments necessary to become everything it has the potential to be. Because the window is open. The opportunity is real. The talent is undeniable. Now it's time for the organization to match the ambition of the player who changed everything. And if they do, the rest of the WNBA better be ready. Because a fully optimized Caitlin Clark-led team is a nightmare nobody wants to face. The next few months will tell us whether Indiana is prepared to unleash that reality. And trust me, the entire basketball world will be watching.